Toby is partner of family in Finland, which is Toby, I was saying that is a very important partner in Holland family. He does with a lot of casualty work, especially for the underwriters. So I would say that it's on the underwriter side, usually. Be careful what you're saying because it's for underwriters.
I was going to say strictly neutral for these purposes.
Yeah, no. And he's delivering a speech on total loss, which is, I think, a very important topic because in the last 2 or 3 years, especially the Italian market suffered big total losses. And of course, it's an issue that sometimes raises a lot of discussion on the criteria and how to figure out what the total loss and actually when you have got a total loss. So I hope that Toby will illuminate us, also because, as you know, all the Italian insurance policy are based on English funds. So we actually have to refer to the Insurance Act or Marine Insurance Act in English as well. So please, Toby.
Good, Jan, thank you very much. And what I'm going to say...
sorry Toby, sorry to interrupt you. It's not finished, just one second. Se volete togliervi la giacca, visto che sembra di essere nella sala macchina del Titanic. If you want to take off the jacket, because it's like in Africa here, so you can take it. Don't be so polite.
Especially if you're from Wales, where it's very cold.
Especially for you, yes.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. What I'm going to talk about is it doesn't impact at all on what Richard was saying. This is referring back to the old Act, the 1906 Marine Insurance Act. So this is stuff that will be largely familiar to many of you. So we're going to have a quick run through some of the old terms, but also there have been 1 or 2 recent cases in the last 5 or 6 years that have a different spin and some implications. And I've got a few examples as well where I think people can be, they need to be very careful when you're looking at total loss and whether to declare total loss, and particularly when serving notice of abandonment, which can be quite a key area. So if I move on to Section 57 of the Marine Insurance Act 1906, and the references to the sections were all the Marine Insurance Act and not the new Insurance Act that Richard was talking about. So that looks at an actual total loss, where the subject matter insured is destroyed or so damaged as to cease to be a thing of the kind insured, or where the insured is irretrievably deprived thereof. There's an actual total loss. And in the case of an actual total loss, no notice of abandonment need be given, which is quite key later on. So really, in summary, there are 3 types of actual total loss: destruction of the property, change in character, and then irretrievable deprivation. Now, if it's destroyed, that's fairly straightforward. We won't dwell on that. But if we look at one of the more interesting nuances, is when does the subject matter cease to be a thing of the kind insured? Well, there's quite an interesting but very old case called Cambridge and Anderton. As you see, there's a very old case, but the vessel hit rocks and she was torn out. She lost all stability, and her cargo of logs and wood were keeping her afloat. And so that is the type of situation where you have it ceases to be the character or retained character, which becomes a wreck. You there have an actual total loss. Many people will look at that and think it may be a CTL because she may be repaired. A more modern example of a luxury yacht that suffered a fire and then sank at the berth is here. And you can see, to give a modern example, it ceases to have any character of luxury or indeed being a yacht that can be used. So that is where obviously it becomes an actual total loss. One of the other issues is irretrievable deprivation on the part of the assured. And we saw a lot of this, many of these claims during the piracy epidemic, particularly in Somalia, over the last few years. We've got a more recent case, the Bungi Malati Dua, which was actually a cargo claim against Amlin by Macefield. It's a 2011 case, but it's based on a 2008 piracy. And I remember the case because the ship got hijacked on my birthday, so made for a less than fun birthday. But coming along from that, I think that I remember that was the 19th of August. But on the 18th of September, the cargo interests notified that they believed there was an actual total loss. Because they were irretrievably deprived, and 11 days later we were able to release the ship, the cargo, and more importantly the crew. And the case still went through the courts. The cargo interests pursued what they said was a total loss claim, and the court actually said, no, this is a clear case that waiting and see would be far more prudent. As it turned out, there was only another 11 days left, and the cargo owner was not irretrievably deprived of his property, but so they lost that case. It then became more pressing in relation to ships being detained longer and longer periods of time. And of course we saw specific clauses that were designed to crystallise the total loss after periods of 12 months or 6 months. So, constructive total loss, perhaps where it becomes trickier. I shan't read out the full clause because that gets quite dull at this stage in the afternoon, but it's there if you want to look at the slides later. If we summarise section 60 in particular, there's an actual total loss there's a constructive total loss where an actual total loss appears to be unavoidable, or the cost or repair would exceed the repaired value. And that, I think, is quite critical. And it's going through those calculations is the key element when an assured is deciding to tender notice of abandonment to its underwriter. I use this example here. There's the barge several years ago we were involved in this case, and actually the elements that we were involved in was the salvage, but the critical moment of calculating when there could have been a total loss and delivering that notice of abandonment is quite key, because the timing of the salvage was so critical that there was a very, very short window for salvors to lay out 2 kilometres of dyneema. What you can't see, I wonder if there is a pointed here. Yeah, the tug is that speck just off the bow of the barge, and she's actually laid out 2 kilometres of dyneema cable, and they had to wait for a little bit of weather to come up just to be able to get enough lift to take her out. If they'd not managed to salve her, very easily it would have been a constructive total loss, because it would have required dredging the channel, so mobilising a huge spread, and she would have been a total loss, she would have been a wreck removal. So engaging with various elements, particularly the club at that moment, and trying to get them to make sure that they were going to provide scopic security, making sure that that was not going to be crystallised into a total loss. For the assured to wait and see what happened was key, because the underwriters were saved an awful lot of money eventually, because the salvage worked. So timing is critical, and making sure that you understand the full risks is part of that whole equation. So that's sort of the factual background. Would the cost of recovering or repairing a vessel exceed its repaired value? This is the critical calculation. And the court looks at what would a prudent uninsured owner do? Would he repair or would he abandon it to his underwriters? And again, we look at one of the older cases, Angel versus Merchants Code, and says precise estimates are, of course, impossible, they still are, and a large margin ought to be added to the figures of cost of repair to cover risks which a prudent uninsured owner would certainly take into consideration in determining whether he should repair or sell. And the reason why that old case is now relevant again is because we had the Brillante Virtuoso decision last year, which reconfirmed that that is still good law. I.e., the owner, the insured, is going to be given a lot of leeway when calculating whether the vessel is a total loss. It applies equally to valued and unvalued policies. Section 27 of the Marine Insurance Act says that. But in practice, of course, most institute clauses agree the insured value should displace the actual value. So most of those terms are effectively replaced. That's clause 19, say, for example, of the 83 and 95 hull clauses. So coming on to the calculation. Only costs which would have to be expended to put the ship right can be included in that calculation. So again, you get the case. And with the court's recent determination, again, a lot of leeway is given because you are having to speculate on those future costs. But in practice, these include the third-party repair costs, towage to a port of repair, including the insurance insuring the tow, the cost of replacement bunkers, the cost of salvage, of course, but the query there is in relation to scopic, because if scopic is invoked, the predominant reason for scopic is to prevent pollution and possibly deal with wreck removal rather than salvage, but there are necessarily elements which are going to be salvage, as in the Article 13 salvage. So one needs to strip out that and look at the pure salvage rather than the scopic. Expenses reasonably incurred to determine whether there is a CTEL. So survey costs, the cost of investigating what the future elements are likely to look like, having consultants to do that. And of course repairs undertaken by the insurers. So the calculation. It is worth noting in section 60 subsection 2 of the Act, in estimating the cost of repairs, no deduction is to be made in respect of general average contributions to those repairs payable by other interest, but account is to be taken of the expense of future salvage operations, as we saw before, and any future GA contributions to which the ship would be liable if repaired, dealing with ship salvage, of course. And now, also, most institute clauses expressly exclude the value of the wreck in that calculation, which is, again, the subject of much debate when you're looking at a wreck. The picture there is the Brillante Virtuoso. It's quite a big case at the moment in the London market. There's an allegation of fraud, and the owner turned up to give evidence and was arrested when giving evidence to the court. So it's been quite exciting from our point of view. But essentially, that case, in looking at the preliminary issue, how to determine the value of the loss, i.e. whether there was a CTL and how should it be calculated. The question the court had to look at is, should the vessel have been repaired in China or Dubai? and whether that made a huge difference to whether the vessel was a CTL or not, because the cost of repairing in Dubai was $11 million more than repairing in China. However, it was held that the most appropriate place to repair was not necessarily going to be the cheapest. And they looked at several factors. The proximity of the yard, Dubai was much closer, the casualty was off Yemen, so there was a risk of a long distance towage, the cost of the tow and the insurance for the tow, the reputation of the respective yards, they weighed that up, the length of repair and associated loss of income, and the relative location of the yards in question to the vessel's next employment after repair. So all of those were taken into account to assess what a prudent owner would do. So the effect of the CTL under section 61, where there is a constructive total loss, the assured may either treat the loss as a partial loss or abandon the subject matter insured to the insurer and treat the loss as if it was an actual total loss. There's a key principle there actually. If you treat a partial total loss, it will not trigger any increased value policy that you may have. So there's a big consideration there. An abandonment for these purposes, there are two meanings. One is to abandon the ship to your insurer by the insured, or secondly, it refers to the notice itself. And of course, as with everything, the difference is key. In providing your notice of abandonment as an assured, you need to do so to claim your CTL. It must be given with reasonable diligence. So there must be some thought process behind the calculation of the CTL. It must be express clear and unconditional intention to abandon the property to the insurer. And the requirement for notice can, of course, be waived by the insurer by agreement, or by the insurer unilaterally. In limited circumstances, the notice may not be necessary, such as where there would be no benefit to the insurer if notice were given to him. Of course, the usual practice, as probably many people know, is for underwriters to not accept or to reject any notice of abandonment as is presented, because there is a fear that liabilities for removal and pollution may well attach to that, and therefore they would be responsible for those. So the usual practice is to reject or not to accept. If it's rejected, there's no prejudice to the assured. The assured can still make his claim for total loss in due course. But where the insurer accepts the notice, the acceptance may then not be revoked, so the insurer needs to be careful when he does so. It needs to be done thoughtfully. And the insurer becomes conclusively liable for that loss. He will have to pay out the CTL. And the insurer may assert his right to take over the proprietary rights to the casualty again, so he has the benefit of what's left. And there is a warning to the underwriters, is making sure that they are not deemed to have accepted any notice that's tendered. They may wish to, of course, but don't do it accidentally is the key. So I wanted to finally bring this up as an example. Time is the WD Fairway, which was 2009 decision, but it's still a very pertinent learning curve, if you like, or a good example of how both sides need to be very careful. She was a very specialist dredging vessel. She was insured for just short of 150 million euros. She suffered a collision off China, and the vessel owners tendered notice of abandonment, which was not accepted by the insurer. The owners then, of course, received the CTL monies, but they were still under a duty to account for the scrap value to the underwriters, and the underwriters wanted to have an open market sale. But because of the specialist nature of the ship, the owners did not want her to go on the market. She had a lot of new technology on board. They wanted to make sure that it didn't get out into their competitors. So the owners deregistered the vessel and sold her to a Nigerian subsidiary for €1,000. And shortly after that, the underwriters decided to accept the notice of abandonment, and they argued to the court that they should have had an equitable lien over the ship. And the court said that tough luck, effectively. They'd waited too long, and the owners could do with that vessel, what remained of it, as they saw fit, until the underwriters had accepted the notice of readiness. That's the notice of abandonment, sorry. So it's quite key that both sides understand what the risks and liabilities are going to be in dealing with a notice of abandonment, the exact moment that you need to present it, based on the calculations, and whether that may be premature if the vessel can, of course, still be salved. So there are several key elements there, and I hope that was within time and everyone's still awake.
It was very, very interesting actually. I was a little shocked about two or three issues we should touch, which is the fact that in calculating the CTR, you might ought to add some margin to the figures, which is not really so kind of mathematical.
No, the court is going to be very lenient. That was the brilliant virtuoso, and there is going to be a margin for an allowance to give there. So,
yeah, also the fact that you can choose, you're not obliged to choose the cheapest here,
no.
But just the most reasonable. It's very pro-assured.
It is pro-assured. It was a pro-assured decision in that respect.
Yeah, of course. I'm not sure whether they work like this in Italy, but good to know. Thank you.